Hi guys, Ricky Pope here, and I'm back finally with new content. This week on the Christian Nerds Unite podcast, I interviewed Danny Anderson, college English professor, podcast host, and author. He and I discussed the ideas of Christianity in horror films, plus scripture and nerdy news, and we'll get to all of that right after this. It is so great to be back with you all and recording new episodes. It's been a long journey. My wife spending 3 months in the hospital getting a heart transplant that we've been waiting almost 4 years for. If you've listened to much of the podcast, you've probably heard some of that story in the past. And for me, spending 2 separate weeks in the hospital for various issues that I had come up all of a sudden. But now we're both doing well and we're home. And I'm so excited to be with you. Let's start with some scripture. Let's start with Ezekiel 36, 26 through 28. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees. And be careful to keep my laws. Then you will live in the land I gave your ancestors. You will be my people, and I will be your God. My wife received a new heart recently, and it always makes me think of this scripture. She had a physical transplant, but God gives us a spiritual heart transplant when we turn to Him. He goes on to say, He does it for His glory. So even our salvation is for His glory and not our own. I am thankful this week for my wife and her new life-saving heart, but I'm even more thankful for my God and Father who's changing me from the inside out. Now, let's look at some nerdy news. No surprise here, but Black Panther: Wakanda Forever took in $180 million at the domestic box office. It took in another $150 million at the foreign markets for a global total of $330 million, making it the largest November opening in history. Along with that, it is receiving an 84% from critics and 95% from audiences on Rotten Tomatoes. If you've not seen it, expect it to be a spectacle and hint at many of the upcoming MCU events. Many of you have already heard that James Gunn and Peter Safran have been named co-chairman and CEOs of the new DC studios. They'll be overseeing film, TV, and animation for DC Studios. Many have high hopes that this will create a new firm foundation that the DCU, as it is now called, will be able to build upon. I'm really hopeful that with their talents, they can help create a more coherent DC universe of live action films and shows. And on a sad note, the quintessential voice of Batman for millions of people, Kevin Conroy, has passed away at the age of 66. Conroy was the voice of Batman Bruce Wayne for Batman the Animated Series, which started in 1992, 30 years ago, as well as many other shows like Batman Beyond, Justice League Unlimited, Batman Mask of the Phantasm, as well as the Rocksteady Arkham games. He will be missed by many. And to start getting us into the holiday mood, from Warner Brothers Pictures and HBO Max, they're bringing us a new family comedy, A Christmas Story Christmas, the long-awaited follow-up to the holiday favorite A Christmas Story. This time, Ralphie is all grown up and must deal with Christmas and all that comes with it as a dad. And being a dad, I know what that can be like. Peter Billingsley does return as Ralphie. A Christmas Story Christmas will debut on HBO Max on November 17th. Today, I want to share an interview I did recently with Danny Anderson. Danny is a believer and a college professor, teaching rhetoric, literature, and film classes at Mount Aloysius College in Cresson, Pennsylvania, and teaches a class on the classic horror movie. Danny and I had a long discussion about faith and horror films, where they meet and where they don't. So long, in fact, I had to split it up into 2 episodes. If you're watching on YouTube, you might notice I had some video issues. Sorry about that. But now let's get right into part 1 of our interview. Danny Anderson, it is so great to have you on the Christian Nerds Unite podcast today.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. It's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you finally. I know we've been friends on Twitter for a while, chatting back and forth, and been trying to set this interview up for a while. So I'm excited to finally have you with us. Tell us a little bit about Danny Anderson.
Well, I'm a teacher. I teach English at Mount Aloysius College in Cresson, Pennsylvania. I'm originally from Cleveland, Ohio. And so when you're in academia, you kind of go wherever jobs lead you. So I went from Cleveland to Georgia to here in Pennsylvania, where I expect to die at some point. Hopefully the last move of my life. And I grew up evangelical in a kind of low Protestant denomination, the Nazarene denomination, which I think is probably pretty big out where you live in Oklahoma. Mm-hmm. And so it's a tradition that I grew up in, and I've never left. Actually, I have gone to other churches in my life, but I happen to go to a Nazarene church now, and so that's sort of the scope of my kind of religious upbringing. And I got into academia. I'm someone who sort of stumbled into this life. I was not someone born to it, you might say. My parents were both kind of working class folks from West Virginia, and no one in my family ever went to college. And so I did for a while, but I kind of bombed out. And then I kind of lived life for a while, and then I won't bore everyone with the details. I sort of stumbled back into college, and in my last semester, someone talked me into going to grad school, and here I am. So I have a very kind of unusual, I think, path to academia, and it's allowed me to kind of keep in touch with a lot of the things. That marginal position in academia has allowed me to sort of keep in touch with the more kind of popular culture influences that I kind of grew up with. And I haven't sort of lost my taste for those kinds of things, which explains my interest in horror films.
Which is part of the reason you and I connected originally. I don't remember exactly what happened, but there was some discussion of horror films on Twitter, and I believe that's how I kind of ran into your name. And so that's actually kind of what we want to talk about today. Yeah. This idea of Christianity and horror film. And as of this recording, Halloween is like a week away. This will actually play after that, but just because of the timings that we had. But the ideas that go on, and a lot of people have differing opinions of, can Christianity fit in with this genre? What's okay, what's not okay. I mean, we're not going to make major life decisions today. And I may not change anyone's mind about anything, but I just want to have the discussion. So, looking at it, especially, older horror films, it seems to be that this was one of the places where it was kind of okay to talk about Christian faith in a horror film. We often see a lot of Christian iconography, Christian ideas. Before we hit record, we actually mentioned, The Exorcist being a big big one that's listed. Um, what are your thoughts about that idea of Christian faith being used in the horror genre?
Well, yeah, before I get to that, I do want to I understand that this is not everybody's cup of tea. And
Absolutely.
I've never been a person to kind of be defensive about my interest in horror and think, well, you should like it too, right? And so I get that some people just have
Mhm.
sort of anxiety issues on one level with dealing with fright and fear.
Mhm.
Also, I'm sensitive to the kind of theological concerns from some, people, fellow believers. And
And
so I
and
am not,
honestly,
yeah,
I'm right there with you.
yeah,
Um, and I'm not a big horror fan in
right.
general. I am simply interested in this idea.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And so that's just my little disclaimer at the beginning. I have my stance on this. I understand there are people who disagree with me, and I don't necessarily hold that against them. And so, but going back to the actual question, yeah, it's a really good point, and as particularly if you think early horror cinema, you
Mhm.
mentioned The Exorcist, but if you go even further back to the Universal cycle,
Oh yeah.
those, I mean, the crucifix is a
Mhm.
major repellent to Dracula, right?
Yes.
And the film that really, I think, if I have to think of the movie that got me into this genre, it would be The Wolfman. When I grew up, these things were always in
Yes.
reruns on TV, so I kind of grew up really just loving old monster movies. One reason being, I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and there was a big town for like late night horror hosts. They were kind of
Mm.
like funny and goofy. There's one on national syndication now called Sven Gulli, and he's on MeTV if you're interested. But we had our own local ones in Cleveland,
Mhm.
and it was just kind of part of the culture, and I just adored it, right? And frankly, I've never grown out of that. I'm still carry that part of the boy with me as a man now today. But one of the movies they would often show would be The Wolfman, and in that movie, the father of the Wolfman very kind of openly talks about God, and there's a very clear sort of conservative moral universe with God at the head of it in a lot of
Mm.
those films, and that's what makes Frankenstein somewhat scary for the time. I mean, we watch that
Mhm.
today, and it's not scary to us today, but it reads more like a drama, a weird drama to us today. But for the time, it is because it undermines a divine order about who is the
Mhm.
creator, right? And so that's why Frankenstein is a figure of fright. And so, yeah, there is a way in which horror films, more so than many genres, if not
Mhm.
uniquely among all the genres, do actually allow for and take seriously faith. Now, there are exceptions, of course. There are horror films that seek to sort of undermine
Mhm.
traditional values of faith and stuff. I actually find those to be useful as well, or interesting as well. But but that tradition of taking faith seriously certainly existed at the beginning, very
Mhm.
prevalent in a movie like The Exorcist, where the priests are the sort of heroes of the movie, and it carries through even today. That's still a go-to. The Conjuring universe, for example,
Mhm.
that is a very conservative moral universe, a theologically conservative moral universe with the fictional versions of the Warrens, the ghosts, the paranormal investigator Warrens. The actual Warrens are very problematic people, but the cinematic versions of them are lovely. So, um,
Nice.
yeah,
You mentioned the Universal monsters,
yeah,
and I'm of an age where those old black and white shows, replayed on Saturdays,
right.
um, you know, uh, in the 70s, and so that is kind of how I ran into horror films,
Hmm.
and I did enjoy some of those. Um, but horror today has changed so much. Um, there's there are horror films that are more traditional horror films that you think of, and then there are these other films that are kind of gore fest
Right.
kind of horror films. um how do you feel about the current landscape of the horror genre?
Well, I am a fan of horror in general, so I'm probably more tolerant than you might be. But there are like I am not a fan of just like splatter for the spectacle of splatter,
Hmm.
right? It's kind of, you don't see it as much now, but 10-15 years ago, there was the phenomenon of what they called torture porn, movies like
Yes.
Hostel and The Human
Hmm.
Centipede and all these sorts of things. That was never my thing. I don't enjoy just seeing carnage and thinking it's cool, right? I think that the horror films that I tend to like are much more kind of traditional in their way, but I do think that really great horror films are still being made, and I do think that honestly, I that conception is rather marginal. I mean, those films get made. There is an audience for that. There is this kind of like convention-minded horror fan that
Hmm.
that is your only thing that comprises your identity. You know what I mean? And so
Yes.
you end up kind of like diving into it so much that it desensitizes you to more kind of subtle concerns in horror and alls you want to see. In some cases, this is not
Hmm.
everybody that falls into those groups. The only thing that kind of gives you any kind of emotional response at all is the slaughter, right? And so that's
Hmm.
kind of what they want to see. That is a rather marginal audience in horror. They
Hmm.
exist and they're definitely there. But I think the larger horror audience, there is a taste for subtlety. The films of Jordan Peele, for example,
Hmm.
he recently, the last 5 or 6 years, released three really, really great horror films, like historically great horror films: Get Out, Us, and the recent Nope that came out this summer. Those are very intellectually engaging while not being gruesome, right? And so,
Hmm.
there is, we are in many ways in a heyday of horror, in a lot, and particularly this last couple of years, there's been so many really, really good horror films out that are not necessarily slaughter for the sake of slaughter, right? And I could tolerate some slaughter. It's not that I'm against the slaughter, but I don't have the patience for it that a lot of people do.
Well, I was going to say I primarily fall into a sci-fi
Hmm.
world, my preference, and sci-fi has had its fair share of slaughter
Yeah, sure.
um, from time to time. So I definitely understand what you mean. Now, I know you do a class on horror.
Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about that. What kind of things do you discuss in a collegiate class on horror film?
Well, there are definitely like academic approaches to art, to film and literature and
Mhm.
music or whatever. There are sort of academic questions that people tend to ask. For example, there are psychoanalytic approaches to horror, not necessarily psychologizing characters on the screen, but
Mhm.
looking at the film for the ways it psychologically engages with the world, right? There are people ask gender questions about the way in which a particular film challenges or adds to our conceptions of gender and that sort of thing. And there are economic questions. So I do all of that. There's a boilerplate list of things that you need to talk about when you talk about horror films from an academic sense. My own kind of personal preference, though, whenever I teach a class of any kind, novel classes or whatever, I like to establish a conversation in which the works kind of speak back and forth to one another across time.
Mhm.
And so I begin in the early days with silent films, and we watch Nosferatu, which is a classic, 100-year
Mhm.
old now. This year it turned 100,
Oh wow.
a vampire film, like the
Mhm.
prototypical vampire film, a German silent film. And then we move in through like Cat People in the 1940s and a couple movies from the 50s and into today to establish the way in which horror films today are still kind of grappling with the same kinds of questions, and they might have different answers now,
Mhm.
but they still are referencing and sort of retilling that soil. And so that's kind of my approach, and my I guess my preferred way to think about art is like an iceberg. Like an artwork is what we see above the surface of the ocean is the tip of a larger iceberg. It's
Mhm.
connected to a lot of social and individual concerns of
Mhm.
a society at a given moment, right? And so I kind of prefer the approach to a film that when we look at a film, it's like a little window into a perspective on the world at a
Mhm.
given time and a place, right? And those
Mhm.
perspectives are psychological, they're historical, they're political, they're social, they're also spiritual. And by kind of taking a work seriously and really kind of pausing over its details and the creative choices that the filmmakers make, we can actually get sort of a window into a view of the world that we can agree or disagree with. We can be happy that they presented our point of view, or we can be grateful that they challenged our point of view, right? And I think that both are great approaches. So that's kind of how I teach a horror film, and I just sort of lead us into an experience with these films across time, and so we kind of get a bigger view of not only our world today, but how our world today came out of a world yesterday. And so for me, I'm very influenced. There's a rhetorician named Kenneth Burke. He refers to literature as, quote, equipment for living. And that's kind of how I like to think about art. It's a tool for us to sort of live more deeply if we're willing to sort of take it seriously. And horror films are my kind of wheelhouse. And that's kind of like the mechanism I most prefer to ask these questions. But that's kind of my general approach. Now we could talk about particular films or whatnot.
Okay, well, kind of with that, with a couple, there's something you said earlier that brought this question to mind. Do you think there is a particular subject or a particular idea that the horror genre is better at communicating than, say, a different genre?
Yes. If I had to sort of like simplify that question, I honestly, in many ways, the best horror films are not that different than non-genre films, right? They ask the same kinds of questions. But if we want to kind of like, I will answer your question as you asked it. And I will say that the way in which a horror film is normally structured is that you have a state of normalcy that is disrupted by something monstrous, right? And then the struggle becomes the struggle to reinstate normalcy, right? And so that could be, and sometimes the normalcy is a good thing, something good that is being threatened, right? Think about the original, or I guess even the remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. These are sort of, it's a wonderful little town that is being threatened by this kind of alien menace, right? And the main character of that is trying to get people to listen to him so that we can stop the threat and maintain our order. That's a normalcy that is good, that is being threatened. And the ending of that particular movie is quite open-ended. Now, the 70s version, the ending is utterly bleak, right? But in the 1950s version, it's a little open-ended. But there's also ways in which the normalcy that is disrupted may not have been good and needed to be disrupted, right? And honestly, I kind of think that this is something. I'm a big fan of John Carpenter. I really, he's my favorite artist across any genre. I do a podcast called the Sectarian Review Podcast, and we're part of the Christian Humanist Radio Network. This year, all of the shows on the network are looking at different John Carpenter films. I appeared on like all but one of those episodes to talk about him. I have an article coming out on Halloween. It's supposed to come out on Pop Culture and Theology about John Carpenter on the origins of evil and that sort of thing. So I'm a huge fan of John Carpenter. It's who made Halloween, the movie, Michael Myers, right?
Right.
I think if there is, but his movie The Fog, for example, is about this little town on Antonio Bay that is being basically haunted by these ghosts. You might call them pirate ghosts, but they're not really pirates. They're ghosts from a pirate-looking ship from the sea. And as it turns out, this town was founded on murder and theft of this leper colony 100 years prior, and the ghosts of these murdered lepers are coming back for vengeance on this town. So in that case, that's a normalcy that was a false normalcy, right? And the retribution of it is the destabilizing of it. But in both cases, it's about a kind of normalcy that gets disrupted, and the struggle is to maintain that normalcy. And so I think that's something that a horror film is uniquely equipped to do that other genres they have their own versions of that. Every movie has a character arc, for example, right?
Mhm.
But a horror film approaches it in a unique way that I think um, offers us a way to think about our world in very productive means, by very productive means.
Great. Well, when we look at different genres, sometimes, especially, I feel like I could be wrong about this, but I feel like horror gets blended in to a lot of other genres to kind of make these hybrid movies that
Yeah,
people that really don't like horror, or say they don't like horror, really love these other movies where horror is a big portion of what's going on.
sure.
And one of the movies that comes to mind is the original Alien movie.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
It is a sci-fi movie. It is a movie I really love, and I say I generally don't like horror movies, but horror is a big part of what Alien is. The original Alien. I'm not talking about Aliens. That's more sci-fi
Right.
action hero kind of movie. But the original Alien was more horror than sci-fi. Um, how do you see those genres blending?
That's a really good question. And yeah, I would totally agree with that assessment about Alien. You can teach that in either a horror or a sci-fi class, I think, because of the nature of the monster in that. Um,
Hmm.
it's um, I don't know, it's grotesque, right? And it has this sort of like there's an eeriness to it. And I guess on that
Hmm.
term, um, when I teach the horror film class, there's a book that I use to help us. It gives us a vocabulary basically to use to
Hmm.
analyze films and think about films. It's called The Weird and the Eerie by Mark Fisher. A lot of horror criticism builds off of a Freudian concept. Sigmund Freud wrote about what he called the uncanny, which is kind of a feel. If you think about robots, there's the term uncanny valley. So there's a moment at
Hmm.
which a robot can look too human and it makes us nervous, right? And so
Hmm.
there's a negotiation. So that's kind of what uncanniness is for Freud. It's a way in which something is both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time, which makes us unsettled in some psychological way. It's a psychoanalytic.
Which is Blade Runner.
Yes, exactly. Blade Runner is a good example of that, a great example of that. And so what Fisher does is he kind of zooms in on that term and kind of nuances it a little bit more and gives us the weird and the eerie. And so the weird is basically like H.P. Lovecraft, if you've ever
Okay.
read any of those
Yep.
stories.
I'm familiar.
It's cosmic horror. It's something from outside of our dimension that is now appearing in our dimension. That's weird to us, right?
Right.
Something that doesn't belong in our universe is there. The eerie is what he calls a failure of absence or a failure of presence. An empty,
Failure of absence.
yeah. A failure of absence. Something should not be there that is. So if you're walking down a hallway and you see a little doll
Okay.
standing at the end of the hallway, that should not be there. That's a failure of absence, right? There should
Okay.
be an absence that is not there. And a failure of presence. If you're walking around an empty mall, that's eerie to us because a mall should be populated with people, and when it's not, it's eerie. It's creepy. Um,
Ah.
so these
Okay.
are both concepts that kind of deal with both sci-fi and horror. Like the weird is very much. I mean, the alien is a very weird creature. It's from
Hmm.
another planet. It's from another kind of realm of existence, and we're encountering it in our realm of existence. So that's a concept that is shared between sci-fi and horror, and so the genre of sci-fi horror is real. And I think it comes from things like that. But also there's other genres too, like comedy. Comedy
Hmm.
horror is a big
Yeah.
thing. Like
Which
yeah,
there was a whole set of movies based on the idea of Scream. That's what
yeah.
scary.
The
The
scary
scary
movie
movie
franchise. Yeah.
franchise. Yes.
Yeah. Those are sort of parodies, but
Yeah.
my favorite movie is American Werewolf in London,
Oh
as much a
yes.
comedy as it is a horror film, and I think it's a great example of both. And so, yeah, horror does lend itself to, I guess, supplementing. It plays nice with other genres, and of course, comedy and horror share something in common as well. Both of them, something is funny because it causes us to laugh at some state of reality, right? It causes us to understand some aspect of reality is kind of screwy and we laugh at it, right? Horror is a very similar kind of critique of society, right? Horror looks at something wrong with society and it makes us horrified at it, right? And so comedy and horror are actually sort of almost twin genres in that way. And so they lend themselves to being kind of like paired up as well.
It was great getting to know Danny Anderson. If you'd like to keep up with him, what he's doing, follow him on Twitter at Danny P. Anderson, or use the links down in the show notes. And don't forget to check back next week for part 2 of my interview with Danny. Well, that's all I have for you today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, click all those buttons, whatever they are down there, so that you can keep up with us when we do post new content. And you can find all of our social links to our YouTube channel, and our online store at ChristianUrgeUnite.com. If you enjoyed the show and want to help even more, consider becoming a supporter on Patreon. We've changed all of our Patreon levels, and every level has great benefits. It makes a huge difference in the ministry we're able to do. Supporters will also get to hear exclusive stories of believers we are serving around the world through our ministry partners. To check it out or partner with us, go to patreon.com/ChristianUrgeUnite or ChristianUrgeUnite.com and click on support in the menu. Before you go, I do want to leave you with this blessing from 1 Thessalonians 5. May God himself, the God of peace, sanctify you through and through. May your whole spirit, soul, and body be kept blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. The one who calls you is faithful, and he will do it. We'll see you next week. Blessings.
Hey.